on behalf of the Western Canadian wheat growers for joining in tonight. We're really excited to host you for our roundtable. We had one a few months ago on transportation and it was very well attended. So we thought, we might as well keep hosting these and having these conversations. So I want you guys to use the chat. So please let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. So first I'll introduce myself. I'm Caitlin Kitsan and I'm from East Central Saskatchewan by Theodore. I'm actually coming tonight from the farm. We are in calving season and getting ready for seeding out here. So I spend about half the time out at the farm here and then the other half the time in Saskatoon working for Discovery Farm, home of Egg in Motion and Canada's outdoor farm show. So I just want to set the stage tonight that this is not your typical webinar. We want this to be engagement, conversation, use the chat, ask questions. We want this to be a two-way conversation and not just myself and the panelists talking. So let's get going here because we are going to only use the hour just because I want to respect everybody's evening and not go over time. So tonight we have Andre Arbour, Director of General Innovation, Science and Economic Development with the Government of Canada. And he's really going to be providing us some policy and connectivity strategy. We have Jacob, Vice President, Public Policy of Telus. He will be talking about, what is Telus Agriculture and what, this means for Canadian farmers. And then we have Todd from Olds College, Associate Vice President, Industry Solutions and Partnerships. And he will be talking about kind of all their applied research and how they're applying agtech at Olds College. So we will be asking questions throughout the night. I will also be sharing a Google form with you to talk about, what is your connectivity within maybe your house or shop? How's your connectivity out in the field, as well as how's your connectivity on your roads and highways that you use, just to provide us a little bit of context of, who's joining in tonight and what levels of connectivity issues we are facing. So before we get into the questions, I'm going to allow our panelists to say a few opening remarks. So first, I'm going to pass it over to Andre, and I'm hoping you can give us a brief overview of kind of the government's agenda as outlined in the High-Speed Access for All strategy, which I can share in the chat here for those who are interested. But maybe if you can tune in, what are the targets, some of those major investments that are underway, and some of maybe the actions on the regulatory front. I know that's a lot to cover in a few minutes, but I'll pass it over to you, Andre.
Thanks, Caitlin. Happy to do that. This is a topic that I feel super passionately about and really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening and also to hear from you. So not just have me talk, but hear what your questions and preoccupations are. I do have a few slides because I'm a government bureaucrat and we have slides, but also to show maps, which I find can help illustrate what we're kind of looking at. So I'll get right into it. So first, what we're looking at here, full map of Canada, and the sort of brown orangey areas, the smaller areas, is the areas that currently have the minimum target speeds that the government has set. So this is 50 megabits per second download and 10 megabits per second upload. I'll get into a bit about what that means, but anyway, that's the minimum target set. You can see, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, but it's not, this is a relatively small area of the country. But that coverage captured about 87% of the Canadian population in 2019. The yellow is coverage of kind of a minimal basic speeds, a 5 megabit per second service. And that's about, all of Canada essentially. So this shows the challenge. Like we need to get those brown coverage areas to match the yellow. And you can see that, so, we can get to the urban areas pretty quickly. That's 85% of the population. And the challenge is really getting everyone, growing that coverage out to 100%. You can see there's a lot of yellow through the prairies. So we definitely have work to do there. The map that I showed you previously was about what's called fixed internet or high-speed internet to homes and businesses. It's a bit different than cellular coverage for your mobile phone. This coverage map shows the mobile 4G footprint and where those services are available. The dark purple is what the coverage was in 2015. And the light purple is what it was at 2019. So you can actually see a fair bit of progress there. And that's due to mainly private sector investment and competition. We still definitely have work to do, though. Sometimes, you have coverage, but it's only like 1 bar. Sometimes you have coverage at your house, but not along highways or roads, and certainly maybe not in the field. So for major highways in Canada, about 88% of the road kilometers have 4G coverage. So certainly an area where we have more work to do. So we'll get into a bit of the strategy and what we are doing. The strategy sort of outlined a set of targets, which helps to align government action, not just federally, but all levels of government, and working with stakeholders and partners. This strategy was introduced in 2019, and it's the first time such a strategy has been introduced in Canada. It set a universal target, the first time this has happened, for all Canadians to have access to the minimum 50/10 target, as well as expanded mobile coverage where Canadians live, but also along roads and highways. Some key additional considerations for us as we're trying to hit these targets includes affordability. So what prices are you paying? Is it reliable? And can it upgrade for faster speeds? And this is particularly important when we're thinking about 5G and future technologies. When we're building out this infrastructure, we want to make sure that it can support speeds actually much faster than 50/10 in the future. And a lot of what we're building out today can actually do 100 or 1,000 or beyond where we can. We need to use a mix of technologies. So fiber optic cables, you may have heard about, that's the gold standard if you're building to a home or business, but it's also the most expensive. In very low density areas like the prairies, wireless may be the only kind of practical option in certain cases. But also there's new exciting kind of satellite technologies coming. They're called low Earth orbit satellite constellations. The satellites are much closer to the Earth, have much better performance. And SpaceX Starlink is an example of this. Telus, a Canadian company, is a constellation in development. A lot of kind of promise there. In terms of, okay, so how are we going to achieve these targets? And a range of actions are underway. This is an issue. This is a big challenge. You may have gotten a sense of that already. And our view is we need to use every tool in the toolbox to hit it. It includes regulatory tools as well as direct program spending. One of our key regulatory tools is over what's called spectrum frequencies. So these are the airwaves that are essential for transmitting wireless signals. Spectrum needs to be regulated because of interference issues. So if you had 2 radios trying to transmit in the same frequency, the signals would knock each other out and wouldn't complete, and you wouldn't have any communication at all. So there needs to be governance of different spectrum frequencies for different uses. And spectrum is used for all sorts of things, not just like your cell phone or your wireless communication, but it's used for satellites, it's used for baby monitors, it's used for Defense Canada radars and Earth imaging things. So so it does need to be governed, but a lot of scope to help promote connectivity there. So one thing we're doing is making much more spectrum frequencies available for broadband and for cellular coverage. That means taking it away from some other uses, which can be challenging sometimes. But as technology changes, we can take it away from some legacy technologies and make it available for 5G or other uses. When we license the spectrum, we have conditions of license, and that can include deployment conditions. So you must build out to a certain percentage of the population at a certain time. And we are continually ratcheting those up. So each time we do a spectrum auction and a new licensing process, the deployment conditions are the strictest they've ever been. And then the next one is, again, the strictest they've ever been. Other things we're doing is there's other kind of more innovative approaches to access spectrum especially for smaller providers. We're reforming our fees to make it more cost effective. Another aspect of the regulatory toolbox is reusing existing infrastructure. So when you're building out these networks, it's high technology, it's fancy stuff, but it's also just basic infrastructure. Like it's building a conduit along the side of the road, it's stringing physical cables along poles. And so how easy it is to access that infrastructure, how quickly, how cost effective it is the permitting efficient, really can have an impact on the build out. Some of this stuff is in federal jurisdiction, and there are some federal processes underway to renew and improve these rules. But a lot is not. A lot is in provincial or municipal jurisdiction. So encourage all levels of government to do what they can in this space. And then the bucks. Major program investments, over $7 billion in the last few years, have been allocated to this issue. With the pandemic, as you can imagine, there's much more increased urgency. More federal dollars allocated in the last few years than the history of, like, going back to the 1990s when the internet was created. So more in the last few years than all previous incarnations combined. So exciting times. It can't come fast enough. I know it can't come fast enough, but there is a lot happening. So I'll just close with kind of where we're at, and then happy to turn it to questions. I think I'm going a little bit long here. Anyway, the flagship program is the Universal Broadband Fund. It's $2.75 billion. Right now, we are connecting over 800,000 homes and a lot more to come. Excellent partnerships with provinces and the private sector. All told, we're going to have about $10 billion in investment rolling out from different sources. And it's not just federal. We either partner and co-fund projects, or we coordinate so that, if we're not duplicating efforts. So in Manitoba, for example, there's two projects. One is funded by a federal initiative through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, connecting about 48,000 households. Another is a purely provincial initiative where they are reusing Manitoba Hydro's existing fiber network to build out connectivity in about 300 communities. So that's exciting too. So all of this is happening. You're not really seeing it today. The main bulk of the effects are going to be felt in the next 2 to 4 years. It is infrastructure, it takes time to build out, but exciting times, and look forward to the rest of the session and your questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andre. Those maps are really helpful for me, I know, to just see kind of Western Canada and where we're at. So if you have questions for Andre, please put them in the chat, but we're going to move on to the next panelist to kind of do opening remarks. So next will be Jacob, and I'm hoping, Jacob, you can kind of talk to us about how Telus Agriculture thinks about agriculture.
Sure. Thanks very much, Caitlin, and thank you to the wheat growers for having me, and thank you to Andre for that very thoughtful and comprehensive introduction. So I'm joining today from the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa. So you're seeing a secure undisclosed location in Ottawa, also known as my basement. There was a cat here earlier, but she's taken her leave. There's squirrels to go kill, so she's busy. The reason that Telus is in the agriculture business in the first place is that we think of ourselves as a social purpose company. So not just a company that is historically your phone company, now your mobile phone company and your internet company, especially if you live in Alberta and BC, but a company who is trying to use technology, data, and the power of those and the promise of those things to improve social outcomes, both for Canadians and globally. And I don't think I have to tell anybody who's participating on this call that there's huge potential, both on the business side, but also on the transformative social side in using and deploying technology and data in the agriculture sector. You know, the agriculture sector is already committed to those kinds of investments, committed to that kind of technological transformation. And farmers on this call and throughout Canada probably know better than anybody that Canada will never meet its sustainability targets, its greenhouse gas emission targets, and continue to be able to feed the world, which is, you know, we're seeing even in the last month how critical Canadian agriculture is, not just for Canada, but for the whole world with the supply chain disruptions because of the war in Ukraine. Canada will never be able to achieve those things without the deployment of new innovative technologies from farm to fork, new uses of sensors, of data, of autonomous solutions on farms, and none of those things. And those are the kinds of solutions that, you know, Telus Agriculture is both partnering on, driving itself. But none of those things will be possible without connectivity at the farm. So it's highly synergistic with Telus's historic core business. So, you know, there's a necessity of high-speed broadband connections on farms, both to drive a sustainability agenda, to drive outcomes for farmers and their families and for rural communities, for Indigenous communities, and the inequality of access that rural Canadians see in their internet has been made particularly obvious in the context of the pandemic. The rural-urban digital divide, I think, has really been highlighted in the pandemic, where people who work in dense urban areas have just been able to continue to operate in a way that isn't possible when you don't have the absolutely best internet. And, you know, the good news is that there are solutions to this, both, and many of them, you know, Andre touched on, and we'll touch on more in our conversation today, I hope. Solutions that can result in changes to the unintended consequence of federal policy, changes that can be derived from technological change, the transition from 4G to 5G, and changes that result in partnership, the kinds of partnership that Andre was talking about between the private sector and the federal government and the provinces, frankly. And so I think that's the good news, is that we can actually, with partnership and with policy change in areas like spectrum, we can address the rural-urban digital divide, and we can connect farms, and we can use that connectivity to drive improved social outcomes for rural communities and for all of the sustainability goals that farmers are deeply committed to already.
Awesome. Well, Jacob, I really appreciated, you know, your message around, you know, technology and connectivity really going to drive kind of that growth in agriculture to, you know, meet some of those food targets that we are going to have to, especially everything that's happening. So before we get into the questions, we've got one last panelist, Todd. So you kind of have a unique experience. You spent some time at Telus Agriculture, and now you're with Olds College. So I was hoping you can kind of share your thoughts on maybe the growth of agtech, where you've seen it, you know, through Telus Agriculture and now with Olds College, and kind of talk a little bit about this space and maybe tie into farmer adoption. So I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Now, to give everyone a bit of background, I'm relatively new to, I'm very new to Olds College. I've been here for about a month. So prior to this, I spent the last 4 years with Telus. So I was their first ag hire and helped develop out Telus Ag for the last 4 years. A lot of M&A work. I got to work with Jacob, and Sangeeta's on the call here as well, in regards to some of the policy stuff with 5G and 4G, worked with the teams within Telus. And to be honest, there's a really strong relationship between Olds College and Telus. When we started Telus Ag, the CEO for Telus, Darren, had asked us to go buy farms to learn. And while my background is farming, and I was a farmer at one time in my career, I thought it'd be easier for us to partner with Olds College than it was for us to start running farms. So there is a deep, long history actually between Telus and Olds College. Now, Olds College lives in the practical here and now. So the gentleman, Andre and Jacob were talking about where we need to go. Olds College has 3,600 acres that looks at applied technology in today's environment. Now, in our environment of 3,600 acres, we have everything from 5G. So we work with Telus to get 5G set up on the right near the town of Olds and the farm there. We have land in Saskatchewan now that has, more like a 3G, 4G with some LoRa-enabled technologies. And then we have land, quite honestly, that has zero connectivity. And I think the practical thing, and Andre referenced it, and Jacob references as well, is that when you start looking at connectivity in the area of the rural area, it is just getting connectivity. Technology, though, unfortunately, is all over the map between things that will need 5G and things that will need basic satellite technology. And what I expect we're going to see for the short term, maybe midterm, is a little bit of a bell around connectivity. So certain things are going to be enabled and certain things are not going to be enabled in this connectivity environment. So you will see things like, Starlink, and what we've heard and what we've seen so far on Starlink is that, quite honestly, it's a nice set of technology and it works very well in a farm yard. But it may not be practical right now to extend that into a field to drive robotics or drive really, really sophisticated AI. We are going to have connectivity in the field to drive GPS locations, lower data sets from weather stations, soil sensors, but that kind of connectivity to go right across the board that you're going to see in those dark spots in Android's map is probably not going to be there tomorrow on the farm. So realistically, we're going to see a mixture of technologies and a mixture of connectivity. Over time, what will drive that will be quite an interesting story as we see things build out. I enjoyed my time at Telus, to be honest, and I also had a lot of learning around in Telus when you started looking at how the world of connectivity is divided between the Teluses, the Rogers, the SaskTels, and the various players. Everyone's got their islet networks. Everyone's got a little bit different strategy towards how they're attacking it. And that also means that you're going to find a little bit different ways of methodology in terms of connectivity as well. There is also, I think, really, to be candid with you, even though we're seeing some of the federal government come in play and actually drive some of the things, and even at a provincial level, it is still a very challenging economic model. When you look at putting towers up, a tower can cost $500,000. It doesn't pay for itself when you have nothing but rattlesnakes and antelope out in the pasture. So how you actually put that infrastructure in place is going to be very interesting. And there is discussions going on around private networks. And things like 5G, when you start being able to split that, will enable that as well. But I think a lot of those things are going to be discovered through this process. And as we've seen, again, it's kind of referenced in our last two speakers, the pandemic and a lot of other things are showing just how important it is. Now, I think the really good thing is you do have companies like Telus, and you do see the federal government actually trying to tackle this. And there's been lots of learnings on both sides, and I do suspect we're going to get there. But it will be iterative in nature, and I don't think we're going to see a really simple solution go right across the board.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. Yeah, it's really exciting about Olds College expanding into Saskatchewan and really having a few different, jurisdictions to play with, and definitely different connectivity things. So I'm just going to add kind of all of our panelists here to the spotlight. I just need to find, there's Andre. Perfect. Awesome. Okay, well, I think, we're all here to talk about 5G, but what is 5G? So I don't know who wants to take this question, but what is 5G and how is it different from what already exists today?
Why don't I just start, just because everyone was polite and silent, not because I have anything smarter or better to say. 5G is, the G just stands for generation. It's just the 5th generation of wireless technology. So 3G, 4G, 5G. So 5G is the 5th generation of wireless communications technology. That's all. Don't get too psyched about it. That's all it means. But the difference is in the characteristics of what the technology can do compared to the previous generation, the previous G. So compared to 4G, 5G has 3 characteristics that make it superior, and superior in particular with respect to the kinds of things that farmers might care about. So number 1, it can provide dramatically faster speeds, especially when there are certain bands of spectrum. So Andre was talking before about wireless spectrum. There are certain bands of spectrum that are particularly suited to 5G, which will carry much, much more data. So you get faster speeds because you're carrying more data over the wireless network. As an example, today Telus provides a wireless high-speed connection. So it's like a modem in your house. Instead of having like a wire plugging into it, you're accessing the cell phone network. And we sell that to people where there isn't a high-speed wired network. And we sell them a 25 megabit connection. So they're not in the brown that Andre showed in the map, because that's all that we can provide today on the 4G network. When we have already started lighting up with some of the 5G spectrum we acquired last summer, already started lighting up 100 megabit connections. So immediately 4x faster. And it will go to 200, 300 very quickly when all that spectrum is deployed, if the federal government deploys it in a way where all the carriers have enough spectrum. So much faster, and you can have wireless speeds in your home as fast as a regular broadband connection. So that's number 1. Number 2, low latency. So that means you can have things like autonomous vehicles and drones and all these kinds of things that require very quick decision-making from the devices that require very quick decision-making from the network. And so you can get computing to those things immediately as a result of that low latency. So that's that, on farms, you can imagine, autonomous tractors and, other kinds of augmented reality farming. And then the third is lots more devices, 10, 100, 1,000x more devices on the network. So you can imagine all the sensors you can have on the farm, checking the moisture, checking the fertilizer usage, checking, the air temperature and the quality and all of that. So you have all 3 of those characteristics are 3 of the key characteristics that differentiate 5G from 4G, and why it's particularly useful in the farming set of applications.
That was super helpful, Jacob. So in short terms, 5G really just stands for 5th generation. I think of like iPhone 1, iPhone 2, iPhone 3, right? This is the 5th generation. It's going to be faster, has a low latency to make decisions faster, and lots more devices on the network, so more sensors. That, in my simple brain, that makes a lot of sense. Todd, Andre, do you guys want to add to that?
Maybe just to build on that, to Jacob's point, and he mentioned autonomous vehicles, right? So if you look at 5G, from a Telus perspective, I know when I was there, they talked a lot about that was going to enable a lot of that autonomous. Now, of course, in the farm today, we leverage GPS satellites and GPS systems to basically drive that. But RTK, which also drives better accuracy, is driven through LTE networks. And so there still is a little limitation there. So what you find in the ag side, because we're building 5G networks out very much in urban populations, and unless we're going to be putting new towers in, that's probably not going to reach the field. It may reach some yards. So what you're finding is some of the technology coming out in the ag space is looking at swarm technology, right? So for example, some of the new John Deere tractors, we will find that it's not autonomous, it's semi-autonomous. So you'll have to have a bum in the seat and the other 2 can follow them, right? Then that's probably going to be more likely what we'll see in an ag world initially until 5G does reach the farm. On the farm today, we have the Omni Raven platform. And one of the things that we're going to be testing out is just, to Jacob's point around latency and jitter and upload and download speeds. And what does that mean when you're actually in a field and you move from high levels of connectivity to low? Are we going to see, a change from 1 inch to 3 inches in terms of overlap, and what that potentially could mean for overall cost? So again, I think when you start looking at that, what we'll probably find is that connectivity will still have some level of limitations over time. It doesn't mean we're not going to be able to bring this technology to market, but it may be not quite as efficient as we would see in an urban environment. And we may have to think about other ways to bring it to bear because we won't have that high end. So for example, even AI, so if you're going to run autonomous vehicles, you're going to need fairly heavy data loads. Those heavy data loads are going to have to identify whether you have a slough, a rock pile, or something in front of you. You're not going to be able to do that with Starlink, right? Thus, you're still probably going to have a bum in the seat, and it's still going to have to be somewhat semi-autonomous. So I think there too, we got to think that it'll be a bit of a journey till we get there. Because right now, again, in ag, in rural areas, it really is just about getting connectivity. And so I have a feeling we're going to find that it's going to be a make it work type of approach for the next little while.
Todd, hold that thought on Starlink because we're coming back to that, to what is Starlink and what is the rage about it. So hold that thought. But I was hoping to pose this question to Andre. So we've heard a lot about like bandwidth versus connectivity. What's the difference?
So those terms are used in kind of common speech, and so they don't necessarily have a defined set term. Bandwidth generally refers to the, if you could use like a pipe analogy, the width of the pipe. It's like how much data per second can you transfer over the network at once. So you see that measured in megabits per second. So the more megabits per second, the more bandwidth you can transfer. Connectivity generally is like a catch-all term for internet access or cell access or something like that.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Thanks for that clarification. I think for this group, it's really helpful because we hear those, on social media being kind of thrown around, and it's sometimes really important to start, what are the definitions? So I think, Jacob, you really covered how 5G can help the agriculture sector by those 3 ways. So maybe moving on, how far are we from getting widespread connectivity on farm, and what are the key obstacles to establishing those in Canada, and kind of some key timelines? Because I love, Todd, your thought about, there's some really cool things out there, but right now I can't make a phone call or check my emails, never mind, have a robot on my farm. So when are we, what's that widespread connectivity timeline looking? I don't know, Andre, do you want to take this one, or Jacob?
I can start a bit, and then
Okay.
happy to if others want to jump in. So I mean, a bit of throat clearing at the outset is to say, like, we're never done in this. Like the technology is always changing, and so there's always like a next thing. In terms of the progress to turn, to build out the high-speed internet part, so that gets you at least to physical locations. There we're looking at 2 to 4 years to get the bulk of that done. There might be some last pieces, the last 0.5%, 0.1% gets much more challenging. That is the rough ballpark. When it comes to mobile access, so there's parts of 5G that are being deployed now, but it's like a kind of basic version of 5G. Like there's different versions of 5G, so what's being built out now is basically 4G radios with some 5G stuff added on top of it. So that should get widespread, like 95+% coverage over the next couple of years. We're probably looking at more like Todd or Jacob would maybe know this better than I, but maybe more like in the 24 to 2026 timeframe, where the full throttle kind of 5G is really broadly deployed.
So what Andre was referring to is something called 5G standalone. And without going into the details of what that means or why you should care about that, most of the carriers, including Telus, will have the first parts of their 5G standalone networks rolled out this year. And as they get more spectrum, those networks will get more pervasive and faster, is the short answer. The longer answer, Caitlin, to this question, and this is like kind of where the rubber hits the road for Canadians who are depending on the companies and the government to partner and build out these connections, is the government's plan is basically 2030 is when you're going to get full 100% connectivity for 5010. And we Telus think you can go faster than that. We Telus think you can do it in 5 years. But to do it in 5 years, you have to change the way you allocate spectrum. You have to get the money out the door faster in the broadband funding programs. And you have to make sure that you are using all the available technologies in a way that makes sense. So be it fixed wireless, the fiber networks we were talking about, or the high-speed mobile networks connecting people. And if you balance those, if you're technologically neutral and you get the money out the door faster and you allocate the spectrum in a way that puts it in the hands of the people who are building the networks, you can actually connect 100% of Canadians with 5010 in 5 years. So that will have meaningful impacts for communities, meaningful impacts for the ability of people, especially in rural communities, to access remote medicine, remote specialists especially, and also educational opportunities for their kids. So in addition to all of the farming technology stuff we're talking about, it's obviously a huge project for us nationally. And that's why, there's been, I think, very good partnership between federal, provincial, municipal, and the companies. But, we need more of that. The only thing I'll say, this will be my spicy point of the evening, which is to say that there's a direct correlation, all the economic research is that there is a direct correlation between the cost of spectrum and how much money goes into building networks. And the reason is simple, because we finance both of those with debt. We borrow money to build the networks and to buy the spectrum. And so Canada has the most expensive spectrum in the world. In the last auction last summer, Canada's carriers spent $9 billion for spectrum. So that's $9 billion that didn't go into building networks. So there are also ways to use some of the levers that Andre was talking about to make sure that the companies are putting that money into new towers, into new connectivity to deliver faster for Canadians.
So Jacob, I just want to kind of drill a little bit further into that, because I think our organization really stands on competition. We want to see policies adopted to support competitions to help rural communities. So what are some, policies and regulatory, and I don't know how, far you can go down into that needs to change, and how can we support you so we see it in 5 years and we don't have to wait till 2030?
I wouldn't mind jumping in at some point.
Yeah, go
ahead,
you go first, Andre. Go ahead.
So first of all, there's plenty. I agree with Jacob in that absolutely it can be done much faster than 2030. And I would say that target was set pre-pandemic. And there's been much more activity since then. So looking forward to what we can announce after this kind of crush of activity is done this summer. We'll be in a better place to say more definitively where we're at along a whole bunch of different fronts. Then, the question about competition, at least in the wireless space, and, spectrum pricing and how the auctions are run, those are kind of interlinked questions. I also saw some questions in the chat. So an auction is not the only way that we allocate spectrum. There's unlicensed spectrum that folks can get access to. It's different properties and lightly licensed processes. It's not all by auction, although those get a lot of the headlines. We auction spectrum like, frankly, any other country does, for the most part in the OECD, because it's a good way to allocate a very scarce resource. To know, if you're paying for it, then you're going to put it to use. You're not just going to get it and sit on it and not build it out. In doing so, we are looking at deployment conditions, but also competition. Some of the players have made the argument that, hey, if you just give the spectrum all to us, we will solve all of your connectivity problems. Don't worry about it. Like, it'll be done. and then then problem solved, and we're all good. Win-win. What's good for us is what's good for Canada, and isn't that awesome? Now, absolutely, all players that are building out need reasonable access to spectrum and to support their business case, and that's totally fair. At the same time, we've seen historically where if we let our foot off the gas and just let big players snap up all the spectrum, they might not have the same competitive fire, or at least some of them, to compete in the marketplace and build out their networks. That has an impact on pricing. Prices tend to go up. We've also seen slower adoption in technology and the build out of that technology. So we tend to implement certain competitive measures in auctions to help support smaller or regional competitors grow and compete. And we've seen that over time, they've had a real impact in the marketplace. So it's always a question about balance and finding the right balance between kind of different competing interests that are out there.
The good news, Caitlin, is that in the context of the upcoming spectrum auctions and the ones that relate to 5G in particular, we can actually, with respect to competition, we can have our cake and eat it too. And the reason is because there's actually enough spectrum in 5G that all of the carriers, Bell, Rogers, Telus, and a fourth carrier in every market. So in many places that fourth carrier is SaskTel, or in Saskatchewan, SaskTel. In other places today, it's Shaw with Freedom Mobile, TBD who steps into those shoes in the future. In Quebec is Videotron. So there's enough spectrum so that all of those players, including the players that Andre was talking about, can have enough spectrum to deliver the quality of service that I was describing. So then everyone is on an equal footing, and it's just on now the carriers to put their money where the mouth is and invest in rural communities and build the networks.
Awesome. Perfect. So I think we've had a lot of talk about spectrum and the auction and, how choices are made between, the auction and that process. So just maybe moving on about, we had a mail-in question before about how can farmers help? And, some people had an idea like, we've got big bins or towers or elevators. Like, does that help, at all? Or I don't know, Todd, Jacob?
Yeah, yes, it could. I mean, again, that's whatever you can do to lower the cost. It's like to put a tower up is not cheap, right? So those kind of options, and I know, like in my experience was more with Telus, I know the CTO's office is looking at those types of things, like that type of stuff that can look at lowering that. So it definitely can. And then one of the things too, I think we should also define here on the call too. When Jacob describes connectivity and Andre describes connectivity, a lot of this describes where you live, right? And so keep in mind too, if you look at the chat, there's a description of the field versus where you live. A lot of the measurement we're talking about here today, when we get to this level of connectivity, is where people live, not necessarily where farmers are going to work. So we need to understand there's that nuance too. When we start looking at how this extends into a field, that's another journey. And we should recognize that, because these gentlemen are correct. We're going to get there, and it's going to be in those small rural communities. But it's another conversation too, to move it from an area where people are living and the community where you can define, or the field that you cannot define today, and make that model work. And that's where I think ideas like, putting up 5G equipment on a bin, or thinking about a drone that can utilize 5G technology to make it more of a private network. Like, those are the next level of conversations I think are going to happen as well. Because even when you start looking at, satellite technology versus terrestrial, to hit where we want to go, with robotics and autonomy and AI, we probably aren't going to deliver that through satellite. We are still going to need some level of terrestrial-based approaches.
Yeah, so Todd, before you move off of satellite, let's talk about Starlink, because if you go on Twitter, that is every day there's a farmer, canceling ExploreNet and getting Starlink mailed to them. And about 10 minutes before this webinar started, I was about to make my order too as my Wi-Fi crashed. So what is Starlink? What is the rage about it?
So Starlink is the Elon Musk project, right? They have a number of satellites that they've launched up, and it's hitting the northern latitudes right now. And and like you, Caitlin, a lot of the feedback I've gotten is anecdotal. I know the president of Olds College, who's got a farm and an acreage, uses Starlink, and he describes it's very easy. You set it up, it works very well. But I think also when you look at that again, it depends. It will work well for a yard. It's going to enable sensors in a yard. It's even going to enable video, but it's probably cost effective within the geography of the yard. It's probably not going to be, it's unlikely you're going to take 10 or 12 of those things and stick them in a field. And then even on top of that, that may not have that same level of data bandwidth to drive autonomous vehicles. So it's a really good start. And I think it solves a problem of just getting connectivity in a farmyard, but it's not the end of the solution as well. And that's where we're going to have to think even harder about how to get to the next level. And that's where you're going to start seeing that debate between terrestrial and satellite, because I think it's a good stopgap for a yard, but it isn't the final page, right? And then maybe one other thing on it, I'll stand in my sandbox for one other thing. So I've been in ag all my life. I've been a farmer. I've spent time in fields in Brazil. I've spent time in fields in Australia and in Europe. And, when you're in a field in Brazil, what you recognize is, holy cow, these guys can produce a lot. They got three crops coming off a year. But what you recognize when you get to that guy's farmyard, you're going across a prairie trail. They do not have the roads. They do not have the railroads. They do not have the ports. And in some cases, the financial systems were not as strong either. In Canada, we had the foresight to quite honestly build all that out. I do think connectivity is one of these things is a public good, and that is going to be and help us define much better what we can do in ag. And so it is going to have to be, a collaboration. Even though you guys like competition, and it's a good thing. It's going to have to be a collaboration, quite honestly, between the telcos and government to get us there, because this is a public good. And it's going to be a really important for us to get this established to make Canada competitive in the space of ag.
Awesome. And I really liked your talk, because a form that, all of our participants today are going to be getting about, connectivity on your farmyard. So Starlink might be, the solution for your farmyard, but is it going to be, your solution for your 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 acres and beyond, and all those fields that you expand? Probably not, right? So no, thank you for that. And then talking about options, Trudy in the chat here had a question for Telus. So Jacob, does Telus sell a booster that can take the connectivity from the cell tower to increase service around the farmyard?
So today we're partnering with Olds College to test that technology. We don't sell it today, but it's something that's on the radar because we understand the benefit of something like that as a short-term solution, and so we're testing. I actually don't know how that's going. So, Todd probably knows better than me how that pilot is coming.
The pilot was good, but again, we and this goes back to my field. We started it with the field, and we could see that it wasn't broad enough for the field, but it was a really good yard tool. And so we're going to look at, that's what we want to do. The next stage is, okay, now this is an option for the yard, but what can we look at for the field? And that's the conversation now we're having with the engineering teams, the CTO team within Telus, is what other things can we explore and try to develop for this connectivity in the field.
Awesome. Jody just has a question here before I kind of throw it over for some key takeaways, but any talk or plans to have ag corporations access the fiber optics already in the ditch or underground? Right now, only medical, educational, or government agencies can access it. She thinks it would be a huge advantage if ag operations could access it. So, Andre, can I pass that one to you, or?
Yeah, sure. So, the bulk of the fiber optics in the ground is actually owned by private sector operators like Telus, and it's their business to provide access to that fiber. There are different other organizations that sometimes build out their own fiber for their own use. These can be like hydro utilities, or there can be, as you mentioned, medical networks. Those can be options on occasion. An example of the project that I cited in Manitoba was about a huge fiber network owned by Manitoba Hydro that the province leveraged to build out connectivity, and is reusing that unused fiber cable to do that. But this is an area that's in provincial or municipal jurisdiction, so it can be very case specific. But linking in actually with the question about what can you do, from an advocacy perspective, encouraging provincial and municipal levels of government to look for where there are opportunities to reuse their own infrastructure. It doesn't have to be fiber cables. It sometimes can be rights of way or poles or that type of thing. They can help move the needle on connectivity too.
Awesome. And that really leads us to kind of our ending question of key takeaways, what, farmers can do. But before then, lots of connectivity connects with digital ag tech and how you adapt it on the farm. So I'm hoping, you guys can use the chat and let us know, what are the hurdles that you're facing to adopt those ag tech on your farm? What is that biggest challenge? So is it connectivity? Is it cost? Is there too many options out there? Do you have some data concerns? You don't see the benefits in ag tech? Oh, and I see that Dave actually has the poll up there, or, I've adopted. So if everybody can quickly answer this poll before we end, that would be really appreciative, just so we can kind of get an idea of everybody on this call. And while everybody's, answering this, I'm going to kind of pass it over. The question that I'm going to end with is really about what can farmers do? How can we help? And if there's any kind of last takeaways you want everybody on this call. So I am going to, sorry, Jacob, you're first up to leave that as this poll runs.
So first of all, thank you again for having me, and thanks for a really spirited conversation to fellow panelists. There's a lot to be hopeful and optimistic about in terms of both what 5G is going to deliver, in terms of our ability to deliver better, more sustainable, high growth agriculture, not just for Canada, for the world, and also what it can deliver for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. So that is, I hope that we haven't missed that important social message in our conversation today, because I think that we should be very optimistic about what that is going to mean for communities. And so that's my first point. The second thing is, I think we should also feel positive and optimistic about the partnership that's happening today between those communities and the companies and the various levels of government. Because I think everybody, you saw it on this call, even when our conversation is spirited, I think that everybody cares about ultimately the same outcome, which is the absolute best world-class connectivity for Canadians. And we're not going to be satisfied until that job is done. And I think Andre rightly said that job in some ways will never be done, because the connectivity the technology will be ever evolving, and we will be ever investing in it. Telus last year said we're going to invest over the next 5 years $54 billion in connectivity. That's because that's the core of what we do. So that's all the salaries, all the ditches we're digging, all the poles we're putting up, but that's significant capital and operating investments in building those networks for these communities. And what farmers can do to help accelerate that, from my perspective, is to make sure that you continue to have active voices in the public policy debates around connectivity, around the programs that the governments are putting out, around how spectrum is allocated, about what matters to you in terms of improving the lives for yourself and your farms and your communities and your families. Because if you don't make your voice heard, if you feel like it's too technical, a discourse, or it's just not your top priority, then those considerations just won't be top of mind. So I would encourage you to engage with Andre and his colleagues. I would encourage you to engage with your member of parliament. I would encourage you to call Telus, because all of us need to know what are the priorities for you. And so that's my advice or my call to action is make your voice heard to all of those stakeholders, so that they can deliver on the things that you're looking for.
Thank you, Jacob. I really liked, coming back to, connectivity really impacts the community, and, obviously agriculture, the industry that we're all involved in, and, feeding the world, but it talks about rural families being able to put their kid into, have school and so on. So thank you for that. And I love your call to action, because I think that's why everybody's here today. And having the open door at Telus, like, come and we want to hear your concerns so we can hear from the people who have the boots in the dirt and on the ground. So thank you. Now I'm going to pass it on to Andre.
Thanks. So again, really appreciate being here this evening. I'd quickly kind of underscore what Jacob said, actually. I have a few different ministers that I work with. One is specifically on rural economic development. That's her full job. And she believes firmly that connectivity is the basic kind of platform that enables rural economic development and is fundamental to so many different things. So super important. And then yes, using your voice is one of the best things you can do on a few different fronts. First, it helps us understand what challenges you're facing and where we need to be directing our energies. When we're dealing with other levels of government, they have tools at their disposal so that they know that it's a priority and that they can take action as well. And from the private sector, partly so that they know where gaps and challenges are, but also it can help their business case. If they know there's groups or demand for services in areas, it can help with their return on investment because there's more predictable revenues there. So thanks again.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Andre. Before I leave it with Todd too, Jacob, Andre, and Todd, if there's your call to action is, we want to hear from you. So if there's a way that, they can get a hold of either Telus, who to be the, who could they contact if they have more questions? Because there was a lot of questions in the chat we just couldn't get to tonight. And if they want to discuss further, same with you, Andre, if there's, somebody in your department, and then Todd, same at Olds College, if they, want to talk about kind of how you guys are exploring connectivity and using that on the farm, that would be great in the chat if you could just provide that contact. But I'll pass it over to Todd for his kind of closing remarks. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
I will echo what everyone else has basically said, but I would also say that we should probably dig a little bit deeper into that conversation too, in terms of how we define it, right? So when you hear the term rural, in some circles, rural may be under 10,000 people. Now, if you're in a farm, that would not be considered rural, and in certain places that would be fairly large. So that level of dialogue, I think, still needs to get a little bit deeper. The idea when you look at the comments in the chat, there is that where you live, the farmhouse and the small communities, and then there is the field. And so again, we have to have that dialogue go a little bit deeper so we have a bit of a common understanding of the challenge. So right now, even to the pole, it's just basic connectivity we're looking at the farm. But we will need to go farther than basic connectivity to drive the promise of where ag tech is going. And that will help drive the feed the world. But that will take further dialogue. So I do encourage us to get a bit deeper in that dialogue and a bit of patience as well. Because what I have found, just like Jacob and Andre here on the call, there is this common want to get this fixed. But there isn't, honestly, always a common understanding of the problem and how it's utilized. And so that will take a bit more pieces. I do think it's also on places like Olds College to start continuing to drive research around this, and also to show what the economic benefits can be and how that can benefit both the farm and both society. So there are pieces like that too. We need to start interacting a lot more with and sharing back and forth both between urban and rural, because this will be important for both sectors.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd. And I'm just going to do a little plug for Olds College. If you want to see some of these ag tech in action and some of this connectivity research, everybody should check out Ag Smart in August at Olds College, because I did not get to go this year, but it is on my calendar. I am booked to go this August. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the work you guys are doing out there. So There's your plug, Todd, for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. And check out Dr. Joy Agnew. There's probably lots of researchers, but that's one that I follow very closely at Olds College, and some of the work she's doing is really great work. So make sure that you're following her and some of the work. Yeah, so I just want to thank everybody for joining. I think this is the start of many conversations around connectivity, especially all the questions in the chat. And I know people had their hands up. So stay tuned for more roundtables. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you, Jacob, for sharing your contact information. Andre as well. Thank you for sharing kind of a way to get involved. And then thanks, Todd, for sharing your email. So everybody who has asked questions, we didn't get to them tonight. We will reach out to you from the week growers and try to get those answers to you. But I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and stay safe if you're getting this snowstorm.
Yeah, I know, Norm. I work for an institution, an educational institution. I spelled college wrong, right? That's not a good sign. Yeah.
Todd, we won't tell your boss. It's okay. Awesome.
If folks wouldn't mind turning on their camera just for 10 seconds, I'd love to just take a snapshot of a screenshot of everybody. And it looks kind of boring with just blank screens on there, if you don't mind. Oh, there are real people back there. That's great.
1 second. I'm just removing all the spotlights here.
Okay.
Perfect. Awesome.
Oh, a couple more coming in. Yeah, smile bright.
I love Dave's smile. He's got a big smile.
That's great. Thanks, folks. We really appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Take care.